أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين. Welcome to the next installment of our lectures on René Guénon's The Reign of Quantity and the Signs of the Times. Today's video is devoted to Chapter 12, The Hatred of Secrecy. I think this is an extremely interesting chapter, and I think that the concept of secrecy, the traditional notion of secrecy, has been completely forgotten, and at the very best, I mean, sometimes if it's not forgotten, it's just very misunderstood, and has been replaced, of course, as with all other traditional concepts as well, a profane notion of secrecy in the modern world. This hatred of secrecy chapter is connected with the previous chapter, Unity and Simplicity, because one could see it as a further concomitant or manifestation of the rampant oversimplification, again in the direction of quantity, which characterizes modern times, and as such it is also a manifestation, I think, of what I would call the idolatry of egalitarianism, which we find in the modern world. And it is also a manifestation of the mania for uniformity, which we find in the modern world. So this hatred of secrecy may be seen in the rampant tendency towards what Guénon calls popularization in the modern world, and he begins the chapter with this. The opening sentence states, "A point that has only been touched on incidentally in earlier chapters must now be elaborated. It is what may be called the tendency to popularization." Then there's a long parenthetical. We'll skip that and continue the sentence. "It is what may be called the tendency to popularization. In other words, the pretension to put everything within the reach of all." Hence the idea of egalitarianism, to which attention has already been drawn as a consequence of democratic conceptions. And that amounts in the end to a desire to bring all knowledge. So that includes traditional knowledge, that includes esoteric knowledge, especially the kind of knowledge associated with, for example, traditional sciences that almost always have an esoteric dimension. So, to a desire to bring all knowledge down to the level of the lowest intelligences. He continues, "It would be only too easy to point out the multiple ineptitudes that result, generally speaking, from the ill-conceived diffusion of an instruction that is claimed to be equally distributed to all in identical form and by identical methods. This can only end, as has already been said, in a sort of leveling down to the lowest, here as elsewhere, quality being sacrificed to quantity. It is no less true to say that the profane instruction in question has nothing to do with any kind of knowledge in the true sense of the word, and that it contains nothing that is in the least degree profound." So there's a semicolon here. I'm going to skip ahead. And the paragraph here on this opening page of the chapter, which is on page 82, concludes with these words. "It even seems probable that it is contrived." The "it" here refers to this popularization, this hatred of secrecy. "It even seems probable that it is contrived specifically for that purpose. For modern uniformization necessarily implies a hatred of all superiority." So the hatred of secrecy, then, in the view of Guénon, is also a kind of hatred of superiority, namely knowledge of a superior order, and then also that knowledge being the purview, or being the unique patrimony of a higher or superior, highly developed or superior human being. Now that, again, is very much against modern notions of egalitarianism. And René Guénon, like other traditional thinkers, especially Evola, who I think wrote more clearly and at more length on this topic, namely that of the notion of caste. And that, of course, this notion of that there is a hierarchy of human types, because that's all that really caste implies, or entails or embodies, that there is a hierarchy of human types, that everybody does not have the same skills, or shall we say that everyone does not have the same potentialities. This is something which the modern world truly hates. And so it can be understood then that why there is a hatred for secrecy, because in the traditional sciences, in initiatic disciplines, there is a secret. There are things which are not revealed. However, let's say in the case of the Islamic tradition, the one which I know the best, in the Islamic tradition in the past and also in the present, knowledge of this kind was never and is never truly withheld from the person truly qualified to receive it, regardless of who they are and where they came from and so on and so forth. But the idea that just any Tom, Dick, and Harry off the street can come to traditional authority and demand instruction, or that each and every person is somehow has an equal right or entitlement to this kind of knowledge is simply completely wrong. And that's one dimension of this hatred of secrecy that Guénon has devoted this chapter to. Now, this comes a little bit further on the next page, but let's just not get ahead of things. Another dimension towards this uniformization, he continues at the bottom of page 82, is the notion that traditional doctrines can be transmitted and expounded through the adoption of profane ways and means. Guénon writes, a still more surprising thing is that some people these days think that they can expound traditional doctrines by adopting profane instruction itself as a sort of model, without taking the least account of the nature of traditional doctrines and of the essential differences that exist between them and everything that is today called by the names of science and philosophy, from which they are separated by a real abyss. In so doing, they must of necessity distort these doctrines completely by oversimplification and by only allowing the most superficial meaning to appear, for otherwise their pretensions must remain completely unjustified. In any case, by such means, the modern spirit penetrates right into what is most opposed to it, radically and by definition, and it is not difficult to appreciate the dissolving effect of the results, though those who make themselves the instruments of this kind of penetration may not grasp their nature. Further, he says, the decadence of religious doctrine in the West and the corresponding total loss of esotericism show well enough what may happen in the end if that way of looking at things were one day to become general even in the East as well. So Guénon thinks that this kind of mass leveling and popularization in opposition to hierarchy and therefore also secrecy is extremely dangerous, and that this has penetrated into the realm of religious doctrine as well, and that there has been a complete and total loss of the esoteric dimension. And of course, you cannot really speak of any esotericism without initiation. And this was an important concern for Guénon, and I think that this is really the ultimate reason for his entering Islam, and is probably, for people who understand these things, the best argument for entering Islam, because initiation is still available. Islam is the only viable religious form in the Kali Yuga. Someone recently asked me that in the comment section, and I said yes, that's it. So this is the situation that we have, and Genon leads in after these opening paragraphs into a further discussion of this hatred of secrecy with reference to an example, and that example happens to be the Vedanta. So on the next page, it actually starts at the bottom of this page, page 83, where again he's talking about this notion of how in the modern world people speak of someone being educated, someone being cultured, in other words, someone who has undergone modern education, and that somehow through this process of modern education and therefore becoming a man of culture, that this somehow entitles such a person to receive what he calls the integral teaching of any proper religious tradition or doctrine. And this idea that with the spread of this sort of modern education and culture, that the general level has been raised, whereas actually it's the other way around. The general level has actually been brought down by modern education. And I think it's very interesting to take an example from the contingent facts of my own background and existence, namely having come from India and the region known as where you find India and Pakistan, South Asia, that the people who are usually the most prone to the rejection of esotericism, and at the same time somehow wanting to espouse some sort of a religiosity, are the ones who have undergone Western education. And the people, for example, in the countryside, the so-called bumpkins, the unrefined, the uncultured, the peasants,
untouchables,
are usually the ones who are still involved in all of these esoteric principles, doctrines, and so, or touched by them in some way or another. I'm not saying that every person in the countryside is an initiate, but they don't reject these traditional sciences and these traditional contemplative methods and so forth. So you still find a tremendous devotion to Sufism and the rituals and so forth that go with that. But you find people who've undergone some sort of education, and then either they go completely the secular atheist route, and then they decide at some point that they need to come back to religion, but the religion that they come back to is what Genon talked about in the previous chapter, is a kind of Protestantism.
Yeah.
Salafi, some sort of Salafi doctrines, or some sort of modernist Muslim doctrines, and there are many shades of these things. But that too is a dimension, this general bringing down, this leveling. And Genon says that the so-called raising of the general level, this is at the bottom of page 83, has as its inevitable counterpart the disappearance of the intellectual elect. And here then he moves into this discussion of the Vedanta. There is good reason, he says at the bottom of the page, to wonder how a Hindu, for it is a Hindu who has quoted above, can be completely ignorant of our present position in the Kali Yuga, and can go so far as to say that the time has come, and here this is a quote, when the whole system of the Vedanta can be set forth to the public. I'm not sure who he's got in mind.
He doesn't mention the person.
So I have a guess. If anybody knows for sure, please chime in the comments. I would really appreciate it. I think it may be Swami Vivekananda. Or, yeah, so that's my guess of who he may have in mind. I could be completely wrong. He may have someone entirely different in mind. But if anyone has any idea, or if anyone knows for sure, and they have some sort of source to back that up, and even if they don't, please do feel free to add your voice in the comments. So the Vedanta, you have to understand, is the highest teaching of the Indic tradition. Vedant means that which is at the end of the Ved. The Ved, the most important of the Vedas is the Rig Veda. There's 4. But the end of the Vedanta, or the text that's come so more or less at the end of the Veda, and they are known as the Upanishads. And depending on who you ask, there should be maybe 108 or maybe even up to about 200 odd different texts known as the Upanishads. I don't know that they're available in their entirety in the English language. The first time that they were ever translated into some other language other than Vedic Sanskrit was into Persian under the patronage of Prince Darashikoh. There's a very interesting article about Darashikoh in the Encyclopedia Iranica. You can print it out. Go to Iranica online and you can find it. There's a recent book which I had on my desk here somewhere. Is it over here? Which has been written recently about Darashikoh by Supriya Gandhi. I'm told she's an actual descendant of the famous Gandhi. Entitled The Emperor Who Never Was, Darashikoh in Mughal India. So they were translated into Persian under his patronage. And he was interested in this subject because he thought that there was a kind of deep and profound teaching there which was identical.
There's some kind of overlap.
Identical. He thought it was identical to the doctrine of Tawheed in Islam. Anyhow, so that's another topic, but the Vedanta then is the highest expression because it's involved with this teaching of the utterly simple, the ultimate principle, the absolute, the utterly real. And therefore it is concerned with the highest and most recondite metaphysics. And for someone, whoever this individual may be, to claim that somehow this doctrine should be equally accessible to all, and indeed equally expoundable to all and sundry, and that all and sundry are equally amenable, not amenable isn't the right word, are qualified, so to speak, to receive such instruction and to truly understand it and assimilate it, is utterly ridiculous. And so that's why he thinks that this kind of leveling also indicates the disappearance of the intellectual elect. Now, when we say intellectual, we don't mean he certainly has no intention. He certainly in no way means what is understood by an intellectual today. Mm-hmm. Some sort of engaged academic somewhere in the ivory tower who speaks truth to power. Noam Chomsky is an intellectual. Edward Said would be considered an intellectual. Yeah. All kinds of, there's at least something worth reading or understanding there. But then you also have all sorts of utterly insane individuals who would be considered intellectuals today, like Judith Butler or something like this. Mm-hmm. So. Intellectual here means someone who is, concerned with the intellect. And again, intellect is not the profane notion of the intellect. I mean, this will come out more in the chapter after this, which is called the postulates of rationalism. So the intellect, for example, in Arabic would be referred to by the term aql. But again, even with the term aql, that depends on the context and the way it's used in Arabic. But for example, in the Shīʿī tradition, in the hadith text known as Al-Kafi, this is the first volume, Al-Usul min Al-Kafi, the foundational principles, Kafi meaning the sufficiency. The first book in that is called the Book of the Intellect, Kitab al-Aql wal-Jahl, the Book of the Intellect and the Book of Ignorance would be one way of rendering it. And so the intellect, Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq alayhi salam, the sixth Shīʿah Imam, was asked, what is the intellect? What is al-Aql? And he says, al-Aql ma'ubida bihil Rahman muqtusba bihil jinan. The intellect is that by virtue of which the all-compassionate or the infinitely compassionate is worshipped and by which the garden, meaning paradise, is attained to. So that's what is leveled down. That's what's leveled down. When you distill knowledge. Yeah. So intellect, if you wanted to go with the Indic tradition, it would probably be buddhi, I think would be the term in Sanskrit. This
goes back to... I think this connects somehow to his ideas that he put forth in chapter 8 and 9, or he touched on in 8 and then really expanded in 9 about the self. when he says that
chapter 8 is ancient crafts and modern industry, and 9 is the twofold significance of anonymity, the sublimation of the self.
Yeah, the sublimation of the self. In other words, that, and one mode to attain this sublimation could be craftsmanship, for example, right?
Indeed.
Like the Moroccan comb maker we brought up in the video.
Right, that's right, yeah.
He says that it's not a kind of annihilation, but it's a sublimation. In other words, you become more yourself the more that you eliminate your ego.
Right.
What people would regard as the human, quote-unquote, element of yourself. The one that is tied to materiality and base desires, for example. When you eliminate this, you become kind of a suprahuman. That's what he says.
Yeah, suprahuman. The suprahuman, indeed.
And it's interesting, he says, and you brought up the general level of culture, and you tied this in with modern education, that is how this kind of cultured individual becomes cultured or is conditioned into a kind of cultured state. It reminded me of something. I remember I brought this up in the previous lecture, I think, when I went to the chiropractor recently. We had picked up a very interesting conversation about, I asked him how he became a chiropractor.
Yeah.
And he says, I hurt my neck one time while playing basketball, and my father said, you should go and see a chiropractor. And he asked, what is that?
Yeah.
And then he said, my life was changed forever. And then I asked him, did you go to medical school? Because I had an interest in this kind of field of work.
Right.
And he said, yeah, I went to medical school, but I didn't get the best grades, but that doesn't really matter. Most people who get all the best grades in medical school aren't really taught how to be a human.
Oh,
so
what a remark. Yeah.
I thought that was interesting in this connection, that the more that you kind of raise yourself in this sort of modern culture, the more that you try to attain to it and become the best in it, in other words, get the best grades, the less human you are.
Perhaps, but I think at least in the field of healing, what's today called the healthcare industry and big pharma and so forth, are they really interested in health? They're not interested in health. In fact, there's really no definition of health.
Yeah.
Throughout that whole COVID nonsense, they never talked about the cultivation of health. And what is the stay inside, don't go out into the sun, sit on your couch and watch Netflix and be depressed and wear a mask in your house and sneeze into your elbow, all this nonsense.
Wear 2 masks.
Fauci, the evil Mr. Fauci, was saying, you've got to wear 2 masks for a while.
Yep.
But, so my point then is, the ideal there in the so-called practice of medicine, it's about money. It's all about making money. Quantity. It's not about helping anyone. So again, money comes in. It's
leveling down to quantity.
Exactly. So it all comes down. It all comes down to that. This whole descent, in fact, into the infrahuman. So Genon continues. He says, talking about this, and finally, the truth is that everything that represents traditional knowledge of a really profound order, and therefore corresponds to what must be meant by integral teaching. For if those words have really any meaning, initiatic teaching, properly so-called, must be comprised in it. So he loves these parentheticals. Let's read this again without the parentheses. And finally, the truth is that everything that represents traditional knowledge of a really profound order, and therefore corresponds to what must be meant by integral teaching, becomes more and more difficult of access, and becomes so everywhere. In face of the invasion of the modern and profane spirit, it is clear that things could not be otherwise. How then can anyone be so far unaware of reality as to assert the very opposite, and as calmly as if he were enunciating the least contestable truths? This is extremely extreme. This is so true. So where do people go for knowledge in the modern world? They go to the university.
Yeah.
Are they going to find any deep and profound meaning there? Yes and no. But in terms of an integral teaching, no. The whole modern education does not seek to answer the question of what is the human being. What is the ultimate goal of human existence? I really don't think those things are expounded anymore, and certainly not in the current historical moment where universities have become
ideological breeding grounds.
Battlegrounds for the so-called, what they call, oddly enough, what are called the culture wars. At least I don't know if they're still using that term.
It's started to come back.
Yeah.
I've noticed.
So, so you will find, for example, in the university, you may find a course on some element. You could actually go and get a degree in Islamic studies. You can go and get a degree in Buddhist studies. You can read a lot of these texts. And this is another strange thing about the modern world. That in the modern world we have now, especially in the English language, and it's a two-edged sword, but you have on the one, you have access to some of the most esoteric works.
Yeah.
Whether the translations are any good, how could they be better, that's another issue.
It's there.
But it's available.
Yeah.
And so with that availability and the fact that there are courses offered in different universities on, let's say, the Bhagavad Gita, they have that at St. John's as well. They have that, I'm sure that, you could take a class on that at Harvard. You could take a class at Harvard probably on the on Chinese classics such as the Tao Te Ching, the Chuang Tzu, and so forth. But is there truly an understanding of those? That is a very important question. And I'll give you an example. In the case of the Islamic esoteric sciences, the occult sciences, I remember there was an exhibition once. I saw this a couple of years back being announced somewhere on Facebook of the talismanic art of the Islamic world.
Mm-hmm.
And by that they actually meant art. Right? Not art in the sense of, what's the term in Greek? Techne?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like art, like Picasso or something, I suppose, yeah. Right? And so they had these images that they took from manuscripts, and they put them up, and they were going and they were talking about these things like as though they were works of art. It's not anything
like Da Vinci or something.
Yeah, it's nothing like that. Or modern abstract art, because
basically it was like an
things like so-called magic squares, and then there will be maybe some circular diagrams and other diagrams, but there's a lot of diagrams.
Yeah.
And you can go to manuscripts of occult sciences from the Islamic world, and you can take them out, and some of them are very ornate, and some of them are actually quite beautiful. But that's not what they were designed for.
That's not the purpose of it.
No.
They were treating it like it was a exhibition.
Yeah, so complete lack of comprehension about what any of this is about.
Yeah.
Anyhow. Genon also talks about how social ideas and political institutions have also influenced this. So again, not to make it specific to Vedanta, but he's talking in the context of Vedanta. He says that and Vedanta is only one example. He says the development of social ideas and of political institutions is first put forward in this connection. But even if it really is a development, this too has no more connection with the understanding of metaphysical doctrine than has the diffusion of profane instruction. It is enough to look at the extent to which political preoccupations, wherever they have been introduced into any Eastern country, are prejudicial to the knowledge of traditional truths, in order to conclude that it would be more justifiable to speak of an incompatibility, at least in practice, than of a possible concordance between these two developments. What do you think about that? I think that's a very interesting observation. Political preoccupations. When they're introduced into an Eastern country. So this is all very far along from the time that Genon was writing. So when you introduce all of these things, and a political party, and then modern nation state, and a national ideology, and a national founding myth,
think tanks,
and a football team, and a national airline, and all of this, then people become completely immersed in these fake rituals of politics, and what someone once called the carnivals of life and death. So that you have a kind of profane religion, and a profane tradition that replaces, and then that eats into every element of life. And because these political institutions always involve some sort of notion of democracy, whether it's actually implemented or not, right? Back in the day, like in Egypt, Hosni Mubarak would get 99% of the votes, and Sisi is getting them now, right? But at least there's this sort of lip service paid to democracy.
Yeah.
And again, democracy has the egalitarianism as its ideal. So that again works against the traditional notion of secrecy. And then there's also so-called social life. So in America, what is social life?
Go out for a couple beers.
Right, but also, I mean, it's sporting events, for example. It's so-called popular culture, film.
Going to the movies, things like that.
Things like that. And increasingly all over the world, not just in America, social life is almost completely dominated by or mediated by digital or electronic means, so-called social media. And so there again, there's a kind of leveling. And even in the area of so-called, let's say, in the area of traditional sciences, and if we want to address again this whole question of the hatred of secrecy, you have Facebook groups, I remember, that have grown up all around. There's all sorts of people who are interested in occult sciences.
Yeah.
And there were a couple, there was one which I was asked to join for a while, and I just sort of accepted, and it was a complete waste of time. I knew it would be. I was just curious to see what kind of things people were saying. And so there's all sorts of people on social media who have gotten a hold of books, because this is the other danger. So there are people who can become self-styled spiritual masters. They just collect a whole bunch of books, read them. Maybe they have a certain skill, a gift for communication, certain charisma.
Yeah.
And so it's very much like the phenomenon in evangelical Christianity of these fraudulent preachers. It's very similar. You have all sorts of fraudulent sheikhs and gurus and fortune tellers and healers and so forth all over the place.
Yeah.
But in the realm of the occult sciences, which is now, there's a lot of interest in it. There's all sorts of books that are out there, and there's podcasts and so forth, and people are on social media and they're talking about these things. But they really don't know what they're doing. And that's true in other parts of the world as well. It's not just in America. It's not just in the English language. So there's a kind of like I said, it's a double-edged sword when this stuff is, a lot of these esoteric works have been translated. And
anybody can get a hold of them.
But in some cases, there are actual people who know what they're doing, who have written things down.
Yeah.
And they've put them out there. But again, they're doing that for a particular reason. In that, I truly believe that the books you're meant to read will find you.
Yeah.
And so sometimes a traditional authority may actually put something into writing because they've received some sort of an indication that this needs to be done, and that somehow, the writing will be out there, and only those who are really destined to find it will find it, and even many who will find it will not really understand it. There's something like that as well. But it's very easy to fool yourself, so there are people who have these pretensions.
Right.
Who get a hold of writings of this kind and say, well, I know about this and I know about that. And so it's very difficult nowadays to truly understand these things. And it makes it very difficult for the genuine seeker of such wisdom, because there are so many
frauds.
Frauds is the word, yeah. What was the term? Wolves in sheep's clothing.
Right.
Yeah. So the modern spirit has destroyed genuine social life. Now, this is another point that he makes. It is not easy to see what link social life in the purely profane sense in which it is conceived today could possibly have with spirituality, to which, on the other hand, it brings nothing but obstacles. That is very much modern social life. It's a hindrance.
Yeah.
Such links obviously existed when social life was integrated into a traditional civilization, but it is precisely the modern spirit that has destroyed them, or that tries to destroy them wherever they still persist. What then can be expected of a development which the most characteristic feature is that it works in direct opposition to all spirituality. That's certainly true of social media, of all of the kind of profane forms of socialization in the modern world. In traditional societies, the whole of sort of the calendar was around some kind of ritual. There would be very important times of the year would be marked by various religious, spiritual sort of events. I mean, Islam, again, is one of the only religions that really sticks to this, in my view. But even there, it has been profane. So right now we're in the month of Ramadan. There will be Eid at the end of Ramadan, Eid al-Fitr, there will be Eid al-Adha, there's the pilgrimage to Mecca. But the Dajjal, the spirit of the Dajjal is the Arabic word for Antichrist, if those of you who don't know. This Dajjalic mentality, because the Dajjal is not just a figure who will come at the end of time, but it is a way of thinking, and it is a system, and that has pervaded the whole world. So anyone who's been to Mecca recently can see it. The destruction of the natural order, the ugliness of modern architecture, all of these things have been permeated. So, for example, in the Islamic tradition, much like in the Christian tradition also, there's the one day of the week, which is a very important day, right? So for Christians, it's Sunday, and there was a time where they would go to church, and people would dress in their best clothing, and it was a very important event. And
it was a ritual.
As a ritual. And in Catholicism, there's an actual sort of holy mass and all this stuff that's supposed to take place, and it was a very serious event.
Yeah.
So Jummah used to be that way. Is it anymore? You go to these big, like around here, these big mega mosques.
Yeah.
With these guys doing their khutbahs on PowerPoint, and it's just
a big social club now.
It's a big, well, again, it's all been dumbed down. It's been brought down to these levels. It's been completely permeated by this spirit of worldliness, by the spirit, again, of the reign of quantity, the desacralization of these things. And there's supposed to be a khutbah or a sermon there, which is supposed to be very profound and enlightening and so forth, and there should be some sort of exhortation and so forth. But almost all of the people who give those, there's really very little there, because they don't really have the idhn, the permission. By that, I don't mean that they haven't studied somewhere. A lot of them have studied somewhere, but they don't have that connection.
Yeah.
And because of that, then their words don't have that power. Anyhow. So the destruction of the social order. And around the bottom of page 85, then he's sort of tries to wrap things up much better. He's had this whole sort of aside on Vedanta as an example. At the bottom of page 85, he says, "The truth is that the modern spirit implies in all who are affected by it in any degree a real hatred of what is secret, and of whatever seems to come more or less near to being secret in any and every domain, and this affords an opportunity for a more precise explanation of the point. Strictly speaking, it cannot even be said that popularization of the doctrines is dangerous, at least so long as it is only a question of their theoretical side, for it would be merely useless even if it were possible. But in fact, truths of a certain order, by their very nature, resist all popularization. However, clearly they are set out." So this hatred of secrecy, again, let's go in the realm of academic studies. Gainon hated these guys. He actually referred to them as Orientalists way before Edward Said ever did. Edward Said's famous Palestinian-American intellectual, but he was a specialist in English literature, literary criticism. And he wrote a book called Orientalism. It's a famous book. I don't want to spend too much time on it. You can go and Google it. Look it up. But in short, it was a kind of indictment on his part of the academic study of the East, but specifically the Islamic world. And for the record, Edward Said was a Christian. And he's a very secular person. I met him several times and had some very interesting conversations with him many years ago. But long before, and his book was very influential. So my point is that long before Edward Said spoke of Orientalism and Orientalists, and Gainon did not like the purely profane academic historicist study of Eastern doctrines, and thought that was a completely empty exercise. And so in the modern academy, you have a lot of interest in the the occult sciences in Islam, the occult sciences in in medieval times, in medieval Europe, in the Renaissance. And I once met somebody somewhere, I want to keep it vague, who was a specialist in occult texts from the Byzantine period, okay? And this individual was actually researching the meaning of these magic squares. And this person was aware that there was a similar science in the Muslim world. And whether there were historical connections or whatever, I don't know. Let's put that. Let's just leave that aside so I can make my point. So this person knew that I had studied the subject, and apparently, in Greek texts as well, I didn't know this. There is some notion that these magic squares also encode the names of angels and jinn. And this person wanted to know if that was there in Islam. I said yes. And then this person wanted to know how to do it. And asked me, well, do you know how to do it? And I said, well, even if I did, I wouldn't tell you. And they were really shocked by that. Because, again, it's the hatred of secrecy. It's somehow the idea that, well, this is all a bunch of nonsense anyway. Let's just write it up in some academic papers.
Yeah.
And then there are some people who officially sort of toe the line and say, yeah, this is all, and they pretend to believe in scientism and so forth, but are really researching these things because they know it's real. And they're very interested in figuring it out.
They're kind of undercover.
Yeah. And I don't know, I don't have any evidence, but I sometimes just get that feeling when I meet some people of this kind. And I really wonder, what was really behind the collection of all of this stuff in the British Museum. If you go into the British Museum, there's some very, very strange things there. Yeah. There are occult objects there. There's things from all over the world that the British basically stole. Why were they collecting all of that? Were there some people who knew these things? I wonder. I don't really know, and I don't have any evidence for or against. I just think it's peculiar. So, when you talk then about these kind of truths and how they're not even susceptible to popularization. He continues on the next page from the bottom of 85 to 86, but in fact truths of a certain order by their very nature resist all popularization. However clearly they are set out. It being understood that they are set out such as they are in their true significance and without subjecting them to any distortion, only those who are qualified to understand them will understand them. And for all others, they will be as if they did not exist. That's very interesting.
The wording of that last part is so interesting. As if they did not exist.
As if they did not exist. So there are books out there. You can get certain books. But will you really understand what's written in them? Are they meant for you? I will give you an actual example. Now, everyone who knows Urdu is going to go out and buy this book. Here's a book. It's called Karishma Jafr. It's about the esoteric science of the Arabic letters. It's written by a gentleman named Humayun Lakhnavi. There's even a picture of the venerable gentleman here in the book. He is no longer alive. I'm not sure when he passed away. But this is an extremely recondite work that sets out a very peculiar system of Jafr, which this man was obviously an adept in. And I remember a friend of mine gave me this book. He brought it from Pakistan. Mirza Sadiqain brought it from Pakistan. He gave it to me and he says, what is this book about? I don't understand anything in this. Wow. Do you think you could tell me? And I said, well, I'm not sure. Let me have a go at it. So these are obviously his own personal... It's his own personal experience. It's his initiatic knowledge. He doesn't say whom he received it from, but this stuff is real. It's legitimate. The first 78 odd pages or so set out his system of Jafr, which is not based on the 28 letters of the alphabet, as it is in most other systems, but is based on 14 letters, which are found in the Quran. And he sets out the system, and the rest of it is all his other sort of things that you can use, and how you use the 36th chapter of the Quran, Surah Yasin, and so forth. But that first 70 pages or so is almost incomprehensible. And in fact, he wrote it in a very convoluted language, I think, on purpose. He's obviously from the 20th century. Maybe he was born at the end of the 19th, but certainly in the 20th century. There's a black and white photo of him. But he wrote it in a style of Urdu which no one writes. He did it on purpose, and then he uses highly Persianized words in one place and maybe Arabicized words in another, and he's obviously obfuscating. But if you know those languages and you know about those texts, you can figure out and piece together exactly what he's talking about.
But all that work has to be done before you get to his book.
But that's the first step.
Right.
Then do you want to actually try any of that stuff? So I think I figured out the book pretty much. But I didn't try anything. Why? You want to know? You could attempt it. But usually these things do not work unless you have ijazah. Which means you have to find someone you have to find the actual man, or someone who he taught, or someone who has the same permissions, so forth.
Right.
And then you can do it, because you have to have someone guide you through it, because it can be dangerous.
Yeah.
Having said that, you can set out on your own and try things out, but you proceed at your own risk.
Playing with fire, yeah.
You proceed at your own. It's more like playing with nuclear material.
It
can blow up in your face. So that's an actual example. And there are many things of this nature. So I remember you find also stuff in the Western tradition. There's a lot of things that you can, like there's this guy named Stephen Skinner in Western occultism, but again, I'm not interested in practicing anything outside of my tradition. But I find his writings to be very interesting. He's given a lot of interviews on Glitch Bottle. I've listened to him. I've looked at a lot of his books. But I do not practice any of those things. But again, you wonder, he's put those writings out there. Does he teach people? I have no idea. I don't really know how it works in the Western tradition. And in the final analysis, I really think our tradition is the sort of last word on these things. You don't have to agree with me. That's my understanding. So it really makes you wonder. But these so anyway, not to get too off the point, but secrecy, in other words, then, is fundamental to these sciences. And again, it's because they are not for everybody. And the modern spirit does not like that.
So can someone who holds this kind of knowledge, let's just use the example of occult knowledge. Let's say I come up to them, or someone comes up to them and wants to learn this genuinely and believes in it and everything. Let's say they're a practicing Muslim.
Okay.
Can the teacher determine whether this person is meant for it or not?
Yes.
How? What is they just know?
Sometimes they just know. Sometimes they, some of these people have gush. They have a kind of unveiling and an insight as soon as they meet the person. Sometimes
it can be a kind of intuition.
Yes, sometimes they were expecting the meeting and they saw this person in a dream, or they knew, or they received some other indication. But again, this is all in a realm which modern people of the modern rationalist and scientific mentality completely reject. Right. Sometimes he may subject the person to certain tests and so forth, or there may be other means to determine, using systems of divination, for example. So one popular system of divination in the Persianate Islamic world is based on taking an omen from the Divan of Hafiz. This is an instance of what is known as bibliomancy, divination through the use of a book. And now the Divan of Hafiz is a very profound work, and Hafiz was a profound spiritual authority, and his poems and his poetry are absolutely central to the Persianate Islamic tradition. I mean, everywhere the Divan of Hafiz is gone. So what that means is that they will recite something, they will open the book, And they take either the first verse their hand falls on or their eye falls on, or sometimes they take it. There's different methods. And on the basis of that, they determine, for example, what to accept this person or not. And I remember there are even in some editions of the Diwan Hafiz, there are tables that are constructed for different hours of the day. The day is divided into certain periods, and so if you want to consult, you want to undergo a divination, you want to perform a divination and you're in that particular time of the day, then you'll take that chart, you will recite the Surah Al-Fatiha, for example, close your eyes and then take your finger and then drop it on that and see where you land in the chart. And depending on what the chart is, you have to count forward 7 or what have you, and then you do that. And it is this most astonishing thing. Every time you do that, you will get a verse from the Divan of Hafiz. You'll get the second part, the ending part. So it's arranged according to rhyme letter. Then you go and you find that verse and then you see the whole thing and the answer is there. I've done it several times. It's absolutely uncanny. But it's not a game. So you have to have a serious... and the funny thing is that if you start treating it like a game, then the answers that you get are no good.
Yeah.
And you might even be rebuked. And I have read that the same thing happens with the Yi Jing, or the I Ching, which is a very interesting Chinese system of divination. So that's one method. I'm not saying that they would all do that, but that's one example of a method. And again, an esoteric science, albeit a divinatory one, which people in the modern world, if they're really committed to the whole modern, the Dawkinses and Richard Hitchenses and Dennett's and Ayan Harzali and these sorts of people who completely reject, the new atheists, as they're known. Anyhow, so there is a kind of a profound hatred for these things, a profound bias against these things. And so he was talking here, when we just deviated off there, about how only those who are qualified to understand these teachings will understand them. Now, he wants to point out that this doesn't really have anything to do with spiritual realization as such. This is a very interesting remark. He says this has nothing to do with realization. He puts that in scare quotes. And the means appropriate to it, for in that field there is absolutely nothing that can have any effective value otherwise than from within a regular initiatic organization. So there are people who are not necessarily profoundly spiritually realized, who can study certain esoteric sciences and become actually quite good at them, such as astrology or even Jafar and other things. From a theoretical point of view, reserve can only be justified by considerations of mere opportunity, and so by purely contingent reasons, which does not mean that such reasons need be negligible. In the end, this is beautiful.
This is a big one.
The real secret, the only secret that can never be betrayed in any way, resides uniquely in the inexpressible, which is by the same token incommunicable. Every truth of a transcendent order necessarily partaking of the inexpressible, and it is essentially in this fact that the profound significance of the initiatic secret really lies. For no kind of exterior secret can ever have any value except as an image or symbol of the initiatic secret, though it may occasionally also be not unprofitable as a discipline. But it must be understood that these are things of which the meaning and the range are completely lost to the modern mentality, and incomprehension of them quite naturally engenders hostility. Besides, the ordinary man always has an instinctive fear of what he does not understand, and fear engenders hatred only too easily, even when a mere direct denial of the uncomprehended truth is adopted as a means of escape from fear. Indeed, some such denials are more like real screams of rage. For instance, those of the self-styled freethinkers with regard to everything connected with religion. Now you see there's a world of difference between this genuine kind of secret and the practice of secrecy in the modern world, because there is a kind of secrecy in the modern world, but it's government secrecy, it's secrets of intelligence agencies, it's corporate
NDAs,
secrets.
Things like that.
What's an NDA? Non-disclosure
agreement. Through fear.
So these are all just profane secrets, the nuclear
codes,
not just the codes, but how such a weapon actually works. That's classified as secret. It's top secret, right? So there's many of these kinds of things. But there's no common measure between the traditional notion of secrecy and the profane notion.
But it still happens, right? I mean,
What?
when he says the real secret, the only secret that can never be betrayed in any way, resides uniquely in the inexpressible. A little bit after that, for no kind of exterior secret can ever have any value except as an image or symbol of the initiatic secret. You kind of see that, I mean, amongst a lot of conspiracy researchers online. There's a big discussion about symbolism and how it's used, especially in things like the music industry and the film industry. In other words, symbols are really what rule the world and the people in power. And to people listening at home, whether you believe in it or not, the people in power are obsessed with it, it seems. And that you've kind of seen it thrown in your face.
That has been argued at great length by many people, but in terms of modern sort of resources
that is
on the web, the website Vigilant Citizen is excellent.
Is the best.
There's a lot of very interesting images that he's put together. He does articles and videos now. It's become a big deal. I think you have to subscribe now.
No, it's still free.
Yeah.
But if you want to see,
I don't know who the person is. He doesn't reveal.
He's anonymous.
But he makes it clear he's actually Lebanese. He said this somewhere.
Oh.
But he's a Lebanese Christian. But he says that somewhere in his website.
Yeah, and every month he publishes symbolic pictures of the month, in which he finds magazine covers and all this. All this stuff is happening. So there is certainly an element of secrecy being practiced in the modern world today. And it's also so interesting that when you point this out to some people, let's say you're having a conversation, they'll be like, "Oh, that's just a bunch of, BS." It's very true what he says. For all others, they will be as if they did not exist.
Well, that leads into another topic, with which he concludes the chapter with a very very brief and tantalizing reference. And I think it's very clear now, before we end with that, it's very clear that when he talks about secrecy, the hatred of secrecy, this all has to do with egalitarianism, the mania for uniformity, a hatred of sort of caste or hierarchy and of superiority, and the same in the kind of hierarchy of knowledge, the esoteric and traditional sciences having the prime position. So at the bottom of page 87, he says, let's just read from, the hatred of secrecy is basically nothing but one of the forms of the hatred for anything that surpasses the level of the average, as well as for everything that holds aloof from the uniformity, which it is sought to impose on everyone. Now here's where he really drops the bomb, so to speak. Nevertheless, there is within the modern world itself a secret that is better kept than any other. It is that of the formidable enterprise of suggestion that has produced and that maintains the existing mentality that has constituted it and, as it were, manufactured it in such a way, manufactured is a great word, that it can only deny the existence and even the possibility of any such enterprise. And this is doubtless the best conceivable means, and a means of truly diabolical cleverness for ensuring that the secret shall never be discovered.
Yep.
So we've often mentioned the writings of Jacques Ellul about propaganda. We've mentioned, I think, Edward Bernays and his book Propaganda. He was the nephew of Sigmund Freud,
and the head of the council of, what was it called again?
Well,
Public Relations or something.
I'm not sure. And there's a very good film on that. What's called The Secret of the what's that documentary on Bernays?
Century of the Self.
The Century of the Self
by Adam Curtis. That's in 4 parts.
It's a very interesting documentary.
In that, he actually interviews Edward Bernays, and there's an amazing clip of Edward Bernays saying, when we were establishing I think it was called Council of Public Relations, or the Office of Public Relations.
Office of Public Relations.
I keep confusing it with CFR.
Yeah.
He says, when we were establishing the Office of Public Relations, propaganda had become a dirty word after the Germans, so we needed to find another word for propaganda.
Public relations.
And they landed on public relations.
Yeah. They even have that in Arabic. Al-alaqat al-amma.
And one of them, I think he gets Edward Bernays to talk about this as well. He talks about how cigarette companies had come up to Edward Bernays and asked, "Look, man, I don't know what's going on, but there's some cultural thing that women are not allowed to smoke cigarettes. We're losing out on 50% of the market of the marketplace." you need to try and convince women
Yeah.
to smoke cigarettes.
Yeah.
So he finds a bunch of, I think, feminist leaders of the time and pays them a bunch of money. And says, go out and smoke cigarettes and make this a protest. And he ruminated for quite a while on the headline that would show up on the newspaper. And he landed on torches of fire.
Torches of freedom. I think.
Torches of freedom, excuse me. And what happened? Every woman, after they saw this on the news, were like, "Yeah, this is the way to fight."
Right,
the
but that
power."
also points to the suggestibility of the modern.
That's
era.
what I was getting to. That this is one example that I can think of at the moment that in which the modern mentality is manufactured and is co-opted and used to sell product. Frankly,
Yeah. Well, the term which I like is alchemically processed,
Right.
and that, of course, is introduced by this very interesting writer, Michael A. Hoffman II. He's very controversial in his book Secret Societies and Psychological Warfare. This is a very interesting work. And then he's got another sort of updated version of that called Twilight Language, which came out recently, which is also very interesting. Again, whenever I mention these kind of books, it's not necessarily the case that I endorse everything that a particular writer might have to say. It's always, there's gleanings, and we learn from everyone. And I read very, very widely, as you can see from the other videos on my channel. But what Genon is really talking about here is not just all of the, he doesn't really mean necessarily, he doesn't really have in mind the entire modern propaganda apparatus and cigarettes and this, that, and the other thing.
But it is one example.
It's one example, but what he really means here is this denial of quality, denial of the spiritual dimension, and the reduction of everything to solidity, the solidification of the world, materiality, and quantity. And that realm is completely rejected, and that to even speak of that is the height of irrationality. And so that leads us very nicely into the next chapter, chapter 13, called the Postulates of Rationalism, where he looks at what modern rationalism is. And we will pick things up there with that chapter. Thank you very much for watching.